To this ACUR ANU student presentation. We acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and pay our respect to the elders past and present. My name is Eochagàin and I will be chairing today's session. Our judges are Associate Professor Wendy Lee and Preetam Bell. Our first presenter is Bridget Eochagàin. I'm sorry, I tried. And please start when you're ready.
Okay, thank you. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Perfect. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Bridget Eochagàin. My background is in contemporary theatre studies, and today I will be presenting on one aspect of my honours dissertation, the subgenre of contemporary political theatre I have coined as radical rape theatre. In contemporary discourse, movements such as the Women's March and Me Too have underlined the urgency and topicality of rape culture in society. Their impact has inspired a discussion on how problematic representations of rape in the arts sector feed into a rape culture in society that reinforces and privileges the sexual exploitation of women. Radical rape theatre is a theoretical framework that can be used to isolate the contemporary rape plays that challenge these structures. The purpose of my dissertation was to explore the objective of radical rape theatre as a politically subversive tool to encourage social change, dismantle the idea of the gaze, and facilitate a collective responsibility to challenge the way we view, understand, and process rape narratives on stage. In my initial research phase, I examined all rape plays written and staged between 1995 and 2019 that may fit this paradigm, and then focused my analysis in on one particular play, Sarah Kane's Blasted, positioning it as the cornerstone of this new subgenre. By the end of this presentation, you will have a strong sense of how radical rape theatre is a necessary political tool through which to contextualise rape plays in contemporary theatre discourse, and what theatrical qualifiers I have used to identify plays that fit this paradigm. Firstly, I will define some key theories and terms used in this presentation that are essential underpinnings to my thesis. Gender-constructed ideology is a feminist theory about how representations of gender in social and cultural discourse are steeped in problematic stereotypes, where roles, ideas, and behaviours are prescribed as being either male or female. This ideology helps in defining the structures that exist in society that cater to the sexualisation of women's bodies in theatre. Rape culture is the sociological concept that is used to describe the normalisation of rape in society. Women are often blamed, shamed, objectified, and denied of their experiences of rape, which reinforces how these ideologies and archetypes ultimately support the social systems that normalise it. Lastly, the gaze is a term coined by Laura Mulvey in her text, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, which is used to describe a prominent lens through which men sexually codify and exploit images of the female body for sexual gratification and to reinforce the gender depression of women. The first qualifier of radical rape theatre is staging a male to female rape on or off stage, where the oppressive binary of male perpetrator and female victim are evident. Heterosexual rape narratives on stage traditionally adhere to this model, where women are often over-sexualised during rape for the benefit of male desire and control. For radical rape plays, a heterosexual rape must be present, as it is used to highlight how contemporary culture is complicit in forcing the devaluation of women in favour for the sexual desires of men. Images of rape and violent sex have been normalised in mainstream culture, filtering in problematic representations of women, violence, and sex culture to wider primetime audiences. This attitude towards the rape binary confirms radical rape theatre's premise that in order to subvert and politicise rape, it must first be shown in its most rampantly produced form. It is only by showing these rape dynamics explicitly to an audience that we are able to deconstruct this problematic ideology. The second qualifier of radical rape theatre is to employ subversive staging techniques to challenge the gaze and its ideology. Laura Mulvey's theory on the gaze articulates how women in entertainment culture have been constructed as objects of sexual desire for the heterosexual male fantasy. Mulvey puts this theory forth when examining cinema. However, for my thesis, I adapted this model to examine theatre. Mulvey argues that this construction influences the men who watch, who, for the purpose of this presentation and my dissertation, I have termed as gazers. And as I use this phrase, I will emphasize heavily on the R to make it clearer when distinguishing this term from gazers, as in plural or possessive. So gazers, whether intentionally or subconsciously, will buy into this fantasy and experience a process of titillation and sexual gratification in the image of women's bodies. Rape on the contemporary stage is complicated by the gaze, not merely through the objectification of the female body, but also the subjectification of the rape itself. Lisa Fitzpatrick, who is the leading international scholar in this area of research and who I had the honour of having as an examiner for my thesis, argues that the representation of rape on stage is constructed to dismiss the victim's experience by silencing her voice and erasing her subjectivity in favour of eroticizing her body. The gaze's problematic representation of women is rooted in the encouragement of its gazers to eroticize the female body as it is being violated, brutalized, and raped. It is radical rape theatre's ambition to subvert this process of erotic contemplation during scenes of rape for the purpose of dismantling the gender depression that women face as a result of their overt sexualization. This can be achieved in a radical rape play through varied theatrical techniques, but must include a disruption to the sexualization of women's bodies when staging it. The third qualifier of radical rape theatre is to politicize the staged rape to radicalize audience perception of rape culture and its prevalence in contemporary society. The political works of Artaud and Serres are influential to this qualifier, as their texts examine the way in which images of violence, suffering, and cruelty can be manipulated in theatre to effect change in the audience and by large society. Where Artaud's theatre of cruelty established the need for direct communication between actor and spectator, where the spectator is engulfed and physically affected by the cruelty shown in performance, Serres's in-your-face theatre highlighted how provocatively violent theatre has the potential to establish an empathetic connection between actor and spectator. Pulling influence from both, radical rape theatre aims to dismantle oppressive attitudes, values, and beliefs towards women in society by staging radical or overt depictions of sexual violence with the intention of shocking the audience into political action. These performance techniques are the unique language of the radical rape theatre praxis, signifying the political stance of each play in challenging the patriarchal structures that promote the sexual oppression of women and the devaluation of their bodies. Sarah Kane's Blasted can be read as a radical rape play. Blasted exemplifies the three political and polemical theatrical devices of radical rape theatre in that a heterosexual rape with a male perpetrator occurs, the gaze is subverted in the rape's depiction, and the act of rape itself is politicised through the framing of domestic violence as a reflection of war, suffering, and death. The staging of rape in Blasted exposes the audience to an alternative narrative of rape, one that seeks to radicalise their understanding of the gender dynamics at play in rape culture. Establishing the imbalanced gender dynamics in the two main characters, Kate and Ian's relationship lulls the gazers into a process of subjectification, encouraging them to identify with Ian and sexualise Kate. When Kate's rape is removed from audience view, the process of the gaze is disrupted, preventing Kate from being eroticized and exploited by the gazer. Ian is later raped in the play by an unknown soldier and framed through the lens of casual warfare. The process of eroticization is further skewed by the use of gratuitously violent staging in Ian's rape to suspend audience belief that rape is sexual and erotic. For the gazer, witnessing Ian's rape live complicates their understanding of power and control, where once they held the position of sexual domineer, they now stand as the dominated. I argue that Blasted is the earliest radical rape play in the contemporary theatre paradigm, as it radicalised and politicised rape for the purpose of subverting the gaze and actively disrupted the oppressive gender dynamics present in rape culture. In the contemporary theatre field, it has been suggested by researchers that titillating plays can be seen as subversive to rape culture and the objectification of women's bodies. My paradigm of radical rape theatre emerged from my research as a necessary tool through which to contextualise contemporary rape plays, offering us a benchmark to assess the validity of this claim. Radical rape theatre distinctively segregates the rape plays that aim to challenge oppressive patriarchal structures in theatre and society from those that display sexual violence in a manner that caters to the gaze. Radical rape theatre stands merely as the beginning of a political movement in the contemporary sphere and has the potential to transform. No worries, thank you.
The time is up.
That's all good. Thank you.
Judges, do you have any questions?
Yeah, like if Professor Lee has any questions, she can go first, then I can go later. Okay. Thanks, Bridget, for this wonderful presentation. And I think it's very timely also, I will say, with all the things that are going on in the country with former Attorney General and all these issues. Okay, I have like two questions for you. The one is that in a research like this, how do you like create the methodology section? Like what are the controls that you create? Because it's like in a research like this, I seem that there are too many variables here. So like, how do you like create that control mechanism for you to get that conclusion that what you are saying about RRT being a political movement and all these things? And second, my question is not a question, it's more like a understanding of this field is that like, how do you see like the implication of this research over the critical movement or the critical research movement in various fields? Because obviously this has an intersection with like critical race theory, even it has an intersection with the other critical feminist theory, which looks into intersection of race, sex, and all this attributes. So like if you can respond to some of these issues.
Yeah, so I guess in terms of the first one, like how I kind of created these three identifiers, the way it worked in my honours thesis was actually very different, where I started with Blasted, knowing that I wanted to write a paper on it, and kind of identified this pattern within that play, and then, you know, kind of took a step back and was like, well, you know, is this an isolated incident, or is this something, a pattern that has emerged? And then from there, I went and read, it was about 110 plays that spanned between that time period that had a rape. And I identified that these three key ideas were kind of consistent across a handful of them. And I think in the end, in sort of the appendix of my thesis, I had about 15 plays that I identified that could tick all three of these boxes. But it also is really like underpinned by, you know, political theatre theory. It's underpinned by feminist theory and rape theory, really, are the kind of the main ideas behind it, which kind of support these ideas. And obviously, like in using the gaze, which was originally from the 1970s, that had to be then adapted to look at, you know, the contemporary sphere and how that intersects and changes a little bit, because obviously from where things were in the 70s to where things are now are a bit different. So a lot of my thesis was about really just creating new ideas about this, like how can this be translated as contemporary, and then from there, what can I identify as new things? How can that be supported by other people's theories? And then kind of stepping off and being like, this is something new that I'm doing, and believe that this is kind of, something new, a pattern that's emerged. In that way, because it's kind of like I'm saying it's a new area of you know, theatre theory that hasn't been seen before. That often is a bit tricky, because it means that I'm kind of creating something new and having to be that person who's like, this is the blueprint, and then from here other people can and research further on from that. And in regards to the second thing, that was a huge factor in writing this paper. I also wanted to look at, you know, queer dynamics and how that intersects with this as well. But I guess for the brevity of my honours thesis, I had to be specific, and I found that heterosexual rape, as is the case in Blasted specifically, it is to white characters, and how that interacts. But if I continued on with this as a PhD, which is kind of my plan later down the track, I think race theory will play a larger part, because some of the other plays that fit this paradigm, for example, Nopaya, which is an Indian play about the gang rape of a young female in Mumbai years ago. Obviously, the racial relations and cultural relations of that impact quite heavily on that play specifically. So I think it's definitely something that I have to factor in when I have a larger brevity to consider it.
Okay.
Yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. That's more than enough.
Sorry, I had a question. Was the gang rape in India in Mumbai or in Delhi? I think it was in Delhi though.
You know what? Sorry, you're right. I think it might have been Delhi.
It was in Delhi, yeah.
Yeah, it was quite a huge cultural event.
It was.
Yeah,
it was quite a disaster at that time. Yeah. Do you have any other questions? Yes.
Yes, I have one question. Yeah, my background is quite different from yours, so I'm not sure whether this question is considered in your discipline. So what are the implications for your research for the contemporary society in reality? I know you talk about the stage, and the topic rape absolutely is relevant to the contemporary society. So what do you think?
I guess like anything that fits into kind of the arts, especially in the case of theatre, and as is kind of explained by the political theorists that I reference, Artaud and Serres, is that when you put political theatre on stage, whether you want it to or not, will impact on the audience and will leave a lasting image. And plays like this are not the kind of plays that you walk away from and was like, oh, that was a fun, little Friday night out at the theatre. It's actually, the idea of it is to make you think about society and how we treat these kind of topics. And so I guess like the intersection between theatre and how that influences society, it might not impact society in a way where a lot of change is made, but I guess what theatre does and what's so amazing about it is that it starts a conversation, in that, when you go and see something live on stage, you often talk about it a little bit after, and you might mention it to your friends as well. And that's kind of how it bleeds out and affects other people. Artaud talks about it as like a plague on the people. It starts with one person and kind of infects other people and starts a conversation in that way. So I guess that's kind of the link between, this is a problem we're having in society, and this is one way that some theatre playwrights are trying to tackle that, especially as was said, like it's quite a topical situation that's happening at the moment. It's not something that's kind of going away or easily swept under the rug. So I think these kind of plays definitely contribute to that conversation in the best way that they can. Yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Thank you.
Any other questions, judges? The platform is now open to the audience to ask any questions you have. You can either text it in the chat box or the Q&A section, or you can just raise your hand and I can unmute you and you can ask the question. I don't think so. We have any other questions. It was a great presentation, Bridget.
Thank you.
It is a really engrossing topic, I'd say.
Thank you very much.
Yes, moving on to Carmine B. Bus. Please start your presentation when you're ready.
Excellent, thank you. Share my screen. Wonderful. All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Carmine Bus, and I did my project on climate change skepticism, and where I evaluated a value-based message. So I thought I'd start with a quote from the latest IPCC working group, of the first working group from the latest report, where it's indisputable that human activities are causing climate change, making extreme climate events, including heat waves, heavy rainfall, and droughts, more frequent and severe. Oh, for some reason it's not clicking over. There we go. It's imperative that nations mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this can include national policies, investment, sustainable development, and individual change. Yet one of the biggest barriers to mitigation efforts is climate change skepticism. So this brought me to my research question. Very broadly, I wanted to look into communication strategies that could effectively encourage climate change acceptance. So today, I'll split my presentation into 5 sections where I'll outline climate change attitudes, theoretical concepts around communication strategies, my study, methods, results, conclusion, and what it all means. So let's get started. Climate change attitudes are based on a spectrum from skepticism through to acceptance, and approximately 35% of Australians hold some sort of skeptical attitude. Now, this can include complete denial of a changing climate system, that climate change is due to natural, not human forces, that scientists are willfully exaggerating the evidence, which leads to a general unconcern for climate change and its risks, and an unwillingness to support and engage in mitigation efforts. Conversely, we have acceptance, which is basically just the reverse of all of that. The most robust predictor for climate change skepticism is right-wing orientation. Now, the predictive power of political orientation on climate attitudes may be due to climate solutions being presented as a requirement of lifestyle change and government regulation. Right-wing individuals are more likely to perceive climate mitigation efforts as a threat to one's values. Now, these values can include right-wing authoritarianism with a tendency of conformity and submission to authority in group figures, social dominance and the endorsement of group-based hierarchies, and economic system justification, the defending and justifying free market ideologies. So how do we communicate climate change to skeptics? Well, traditionally, science communication has used a deficit model to encourage climate attitudes. It is assumed that information is processed objectively, and that skepticism is just due to a lack of climate change knowledge. But overwhelmingly, research shows that increased knowledge on climate change does not equate to acceptance. And this is probably due to directionally motivated reasoning, which refers to a set of cognitive biases where information is not processed objectively, but rather individuals are motivated to process information that confirms, enhances, or protects their prior beliefs. So when presented with climate change information, it is likely to be rejected because it doesn't align with those skeptical attitudes. And research has actually demonstrated that the rejection of information can actually reinforce skepticism, creating these backfire effects. In addition to this, we have social identity, which is defined as a component of an individual's self-concept based on social group membership. Now, this can include your political orientation. We create in versus out group tendencies, which create a host of biases. So attitudes and behaviors start to align to those in-group norms as a protective form from the out-group. And it reduces critical appraisal of in-group opinion and decreases the likelihood to change attitudes or behavior. So taking into consideration all of these different biases, Hornsey and Fielding has proposed a value-based communication strategy using Jiu-Jitsu as a metaphor. Now, for those who don't know, Jiu-Jitsu is a martial art which uses the weight and momentum of the opponent to achieve victory. So rather than educating skeptics, it aims to tailor communications to the skeptic's values. So aligned values then capture the attention and acceptance of the message due to directionally motivated reasoning and in-group alignment. Importantly here, it doesn't override the biases, but work with them as momentum to influence change. So this led to a more nuanced question of, are value-based messages effective in encouraging climate change acceptance? So I looked at a few different variables here, primarily right-wing orientation and values. Then I looked at climate change attitudes, a general climate change attitude scale, as well as how people feel around climate science. Participants were randomized into 2 different groups, an education-based message, which represented that deficit model, and a right-wing value-based message. And after all of that, we measured the perceived level to which the message contained values that aligned to the participant, and if they felt that the message came from an in-group member. Now, for these messages, the education-based message was actually derived from an IPCC press release that aimed to educate the public around devaluing fossil fuels. For the right-wing value-based message, I actually curated elements of different studies that were shown to be effective and put them together into one message that underpinned the main 3 values of right-wing orientation. And importantly, I made sure it was written in first person to really elicit a strong in or out group response. So for the design, I wanted to just confirm the relationship between political orientation and values with climate change attitudes. I then tried to assess any change over time between an education-based or a value-based message, between right-wing versus left-wing participants, and I measured them at 3 time points: before the message, just after the message, and after a 1-week follow-up. I also looked at that social identity alignment for those, if there was any differences between those that had high alignment with the message and those who had low alignment with the message. I ended up with 189 participants, aged 18 to 86, and I tried to make sure that we had roughly equal numbers of left and right wing. So for my results, well, just as we expected, political orientation was strongly related to climate change attitudes, where the more left you are, the more likely you're going to accept climate change, and the more right, the more likely you're going to be a skeptic. And just note this R value here from the Pearson's correlation, because with the right-wing values, what we actually found is the same trend, but social dominance and system justification actually showed a greater R value. As for the change over time between the 2 messages, I found no evidence of any change over time. There was no significant difference. For the social identity alignment, though, this is quite interesting. So for the control group, the more likely you were to align with the group, the more likely you were to accept climate change. And same and in reverse for the low and skepticism. As for the experimental group, there was no significant difference, and the attitudes were actually relatively even between those who aligned with the message and those who didn't. So for my conclusions, my correlations were definitely supported in that right-wing orientation and values were associated with skepticism. But I found no differences between the education and value-based message across time. And interestingly, social identity alignment showed greater acceptance for those who are high alignment, but it was only in the control group. What does this actually mean? Well, right-wing values are stronger than orientation. Now, although this is only correlational, it does support the idea that climate change is perceived to be a threat to one's values. And it could also imply that climate solutions might be more divisive in itself than climate change. And this is actually really powerful implications on how we communicate climate solutions moving forward. As for the no effective value-based messaging, well, it could be that it just simply didn't work, or perhaps it's due to priming effects. I was actually one of the first studies to look at pre and post message of climate attitudes. Now, for a skeptic that might have been approached with that climate attitude scale at the onset, it could have elicited that directly motivated rejection of the information right then and there. So it didn't matter what the message was going to be, they're already going to reject it. So that could be a thing. Or perhaps it's due to the message not actually being clear enough, or that the values were strong enough to elicit that acceptance of the message. As for the limitations of the deficit model, the education-based message did not show any difference either. So this actually supports the idea that perhaps directionally motivated reasoning is here, and also that we should continue researching other communication strategies besides educating. For the high alignment, well, we need to be careful here. So high alignment perhaps equals acceptance, but it could be this was only in the education-based message. And it could be that those were already going to be accepting climate change because they aligned to that message to begin with. What's really important here is that commonality between the high and low within that experimental group. So this actually is quite interesting because climate change is such a polarized problem. This is like evidence that we could find common ground and could be a useful tool moving forward. One thing's for certain, though, is that alignment could be more influential than values alone. This leads to some future directions. I think we need to focus further on identity alignment and how we can increase this, and also how we can depolarize climate change, and perhaps value-based or identity-aligned messages could increase this commonality. And I also would be interested in looking at isolated messages with isolated values. So I just used a mix in one message, but seeing that economic system justification and social dominance were higher. Okay, sorry, that's the end anyway. So there we go.
Judges, do you have any questions?
I'll say a lot, but I'll give Professor Wendy to go first.
Yes, I have a couple of questions. The first one I would like to ask, did you consider include social desirability scale in the research design? Because when it comes to climate change, maybe people are inclined to answer the questions aligned with the social acceptable answers. And also in your analysis, did you control the covariates? For example, for example, gender or whatsoever have the difference impact? Yeah, because I can't see that. And also, is educational material is one of the factors contributing to the no change in the after the communication?
Yeah, okay, I'll try to answer all of them. So for the first one on social desirability, that's actually a really interesting approach to looking at it. So the way I tried to recruit participants was through snowballing effect. And I actually, part of that was finding groups on Facebook that were very heavily anti-climate change to begin with. So they were, associated with that and allowed the snowballing from that to occur just as much as elsewhere, because I think if I were just to do a convenient sample with the people around me, there would, I think, be a higher level of that social desirability. But I think that's something to consider moving forward, that I could put in some sort of measure to confound for that, to just balance that out. I have to mention though, what I've shown you guys today was actually probably maybe a third of the data I collected. So I actually was implemented around quite a few other scales that I used. For example, I looked into tendencies towards accepting misinformation and things like that. But for the purpose of today, it was already hard enough to get it into 10 minutes. So I didn't include all of those things. And then the second was on the covariates, is that correct? Yeah, all right. So I looked at all sorts of different things. So I included age, income, education level, as well as experience to climate change. And when I ran the correlations with all of those, actually what I found was education was slightly related to climate change attitudes, but the level to which was actually really quite small. And when it comes to age, there was almost like I used quite a strong level of significance. So it was 0.001 and it was one-tailed rather than two-tailed on this specifically, because I knew there was quite a few other covariates. So I did run a lot of those analyses with those in place, but I just found that they weren't strong enough to actually warrant us to actually really put it through all the way. And then the last question, sorry, you might have to remind me of the third question that you asked.
Yeah, and I will give you the last question again. I just want to ask for the education, because you mentioned that you use correlation analysis, but education is a categorical variable. So I think should use ANOVA a chi-square test rather than correlation, but that's another thing for you to consider for your thesis.
Yeah.
The third question is educational material or the approach. Are they the contributing factors of the no change in result?
Yeah, so the no change in results in the education-based message is what you're asking, is the actual message I used. Is that what you're asking? Yeah, so I tried to and represent what is currently being used out there, that scientists trying to communicate their findings or their research as a form of trying to create pro-environmental mitigation actions or behaviors in some way, or change in attitudes. So that's why I just directly got it from an IPCC press release, because I just wanted a direct example. But moving forward, actually part of my PhD proposal application was actually putting in different variants of what that might look like, and working actually with focus groups on different forms of different messages. So it's something I definitely realized as a limitation to my study, and I think also a complete real control at the end would be more useful as well, like a third message that was literally on, I don't know, washing cars or something really random. That would actually been more useful. But I think this is the learning experience of being a new emerging researcher, right? Is you try your best to work it all out, and then it's at the end you're going, I should have done this, oh my god, I should have done that. But that's what I'm hoping to do moving forward. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I'm not critiquing on your research, but just because I'm quite familiar with this area. I think you're from psychology as well.
Yeah.
So I have lots of questions. Yeah, wonderful presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your questions.
Hi, Carmine. Excellent presentation, and I'll say that I do not have a background in climate change from your perspective, but from a legal and a human rights perspective. So my question is more on your conclusion on how do you come to that conclusion? It's like, when did you when you did your study, like, did you also look into the geographical variation? Like, is there a difference between like people coming from like age, income, and education, coming from inner cities, or like coming from the regional area, specifically different communities? Okay, and my second question will be that, like, in your information, you talked about how education should be, like, how the material should be given or disseminated to the people. So my variation is that, in your research, did you look into that, whether expert or like trust to the government or trust towards the expert is an important criteria, or having this different dimension?
That's awesome. I love that. Okay, so to answer the first one, differences geographically dispersed, there is part of my research when I was doing the literature review prior to the actual study. I did come across fair few where it looks like rural versus urban, and I think that was an element I was considering to put in. But like I was already mentioning, you know, this is even 1/3. I had to scope it at one point of just kind of going, okay, what can I do? But I think moving forward, I definitely want to make sure I put those elements in. I also wanted to include that experience to extreme weather and whether people were to, you know, so there was an element of that. And again, weirdly enough, I found no link at all, which is actually quite surprising, but warrants further investigation. I think that's an element I'm going to be putting into my PhD as well, because there is evidence to support those differences there for sure. And then the second question, sorry, I always seem to do this. I go on a train of thought and then I have to remind myself back to the second question being, can you give me a quick reminder?
So what I was wondering is that you, like, your entire thesis also talks about education and how the impact of education has on the people having an idea of climate change. So I was wondering that if your research indicated towards trust towards the government or trust towards the experts getting the data, because I think that's one of the biggest issue we're facing during the vaccine also, and also facing the climate change. Like, do you have like an...
Yeah, and they're very similar actually. One of my supervisors is on the vaccine style, which is what worked really well in my favor. But yeah, definitely there's an element of mistrust that's happening. And so that right-wing authoritarian scale, there's an part of that scale actually measures a little bit of that mistrust for the government, and then more trust towards, say, more conservative ideologies. So it actually does look a little bit at it, but probably not as much as I would like to see. But that is definitely an area I think I should be including moving forward, because that's what we're seeing, especially with the vaccines at the moment, is that anti-trust of the science and anti-science attitudes. And yeah, so like I said, there were elements of that within the scales I actually utilized, but I don't think it was a variable in itself that I'll have to look into, I think, because it's probably there.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Now the platform is open to all the audiences to ask any question. Yes, we already have. Yep.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. This is it's kind of broad. I'm always wondering why climate skepticism is so quintessential to right-wing ideologies. And I was wondering if you could shed any light on that, because I'm very interested in climate change and discussions and discourses about climate change personally, not so much academically yet. So I was just wondering if you had anything to sort of illuminate that from your research.
Yeah, definitely. So I only touched on it briefly, but basically what the research shows with that big, really strong link between those two things is that, and I mentioned it at the very end with the correlation, is that it's more like climate change itself. It's not climate change that's the problem, it's how we propose the solutions. So the solutions are demanding us to change the way we do our system. It's demanding us to do changing the status quo. It's questioning how we actually run our economy. Now, all of those things are innately progressive on the left-wing side. And so the more far right you are, the more likely you're trying to maintain the status quo and maintain the normality, and also really high levels of that free market capitalistic ideologies around our economy and how our economy should be run with less government regulation and more free market. So the way that we kind of look at climate change solutions are a direct threat to all of those values. And that's why we see such a strong relationship, and actually questions that it might not be climate change so much, but more so around the solutions. And I actually read one really interesting qualitative study that's been recent, interviewing right-wing individuals that were either skeptic or not skeptic, and going through what their how they feel around climate solutions. And actually it was really interesting thematic analysis where individuals that endorse climate change and were more welcome to mitigation efforts and supporting them and policy and things like that were definitely solutions that were based around bolstering the economy and investing in renewable technologies to create more jobs and things like that. That's where we actually see that link of where you could see a crossover. So it's how we frame our solutions, I think, is what we need to be doing moving forward. I hope that answers.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, really interesting. That was a great answer. Thank you.
No
I also put in the chat, I would love to read your paper if you could email it to me.
I would
possibly
love that.
That study you mentioned, I would love to have a look at that too. I've popped my email in the chat. I would love to, read them.
Thank you. Yeah. And if
Great
anyone else
presentation.
is interested, maybe I'll just put my email address in the thing and you can email me, and I'm more than happy to communicate with this longer, because this is definitely something I want to continue pursuing moving forward. So I'm happy to shed light wherever. So I might just pop that in.
Very well. Do we have any other questions? I guess not. Carmen, you can actually save the chat if you just go to the three dots, and you can actually save the chat. So everything, Rebecca, for you as well, if you want to save the chat, you can actually click on the three dots and you can save the entire chat. So you'll have her email address copied.
Excellent, thank you.
No worries. So I think if you have already saved the chat, I think this brings us to the end of today's session. Thank you, Preetham and Wendy, for judging, and congratulations to all the presenters. It was amazing. The recording will be made available online following the conference, and we hope to see you in other conference sessions this week. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.